Okay, we come to chapter 10 of the book of Genesis this evening. We saw last week the events that took place after the flood, which had come upon the world, and Noah and his sons and their families coming out of the ark, and the things that happened after that, with God establishing this covenant with Noah that he would not flood the world again, destroy the world by a flood. And then we had that incident concerning Noah and his drunkenness and the curse that was placed upon Canaan as a result of that, and the blessing upon Shem and Japheth. We come into chapter 10 this evening then. And in these two chapters, chapters 10 and 11, we're looking at the origin of the nations here. And we have a lot of names in these chapters, particularly chapter 10 and the second part of chapter 11. And sometimes it's perhaps a bit easy to skip over these bits because the names are unfamiliar to us or they're difficult for us to pronounce. But these sorts of chapters are well worth looking into because there's usually lots of information in there that is helpful to us and that helps us to understand the bigger picture of what the story of the Bible is all about. So in chapter 10, we have the record of the descendants of Noah's three sons of Japheth, Ham, and Shem. And the account of the descendants of Noah's three sons is introduced with the words there in verse 1. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood. This again is another of these introductory statements that we've noted in the book of Genesis, which seem to mark off a new section or the beginning of a new section or source of material that's being used. Back in chapter 5, this is the book of the generations of Adam. In chapter 6, verse 9, these are the generations of Noah. And then here once again in chapter 10, these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So the names of the sons born to the three sons of Noah are after the flood are recorded here in this chapter. And when we look at the names that are mentioned here, they're not all names of individuals, but they are names of nations or names of tribes or family groups, and they're often in the plural form. So we shouldn't think of these as being referring to actually to individual persons themselves, but rather to groups or to nations or to tribal groups. The sons of Japheth are listed first here in verses 2 to 5. Mentions the sons of Japheth, and then we go into the list of names: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tisra. And then the sons of Gomer followed through Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. From these the coastal people spread. These are the sons of Japheth in their lands, each with his own language, by their families in their nations. The nations who descended from Japheth are ones which populated, or generally thought to be the ones that populated the regions from India, Asia Minor, which today we would call Turkey, and into southern Europe. In verse 4 there, the name that is recorded there as the sons of Japhan, Elisha, that group are thought to be the Greeks. Kittim, we have the name Kittim there as well in verse 4. That's identified as Cyprus. And these were some of the nations that were further from Israel itself, and so perhaps that's the reason why I mentioned quite briefly here. Some of the nations, these nations or these individuals are recognizable to us, but others are perhaps less so. Verse 5 there mentions the coastal peoples. From these, the coastal peoples spread, which may perhaps be a reference to Europe or to the Mediterranean coasts of southern Europe. So those are the descendants of Japheth in the first 5 verses there of chapter 10. And then in chapter 10, verses 6 to 20, we have a longer list here of the sons or the descendants of Ham. We won't read through all of these, but we'll just note some of the things that are mentioned here. It begins in verse 6, the sons of Ham. 4 are named here: Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. And then the sons of Cush are then listed as well there, going further on. Cush is usually identified as Ethiopia. Egypt is the translation in most versions of the next son there, which we're familiar with. Egypt, of course. In the authorized version, the name is Mizraim, which is the Hebrew name for Egypt that is used there in the authorized version. A special mention is made here of a character named Nimrod in 8 to 12. We're told there in verse 8 that Cush, that's the one of the first listed of the sons of Ham, Cush became the father of Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, and Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. So this character Nimrod mentioned here, he's described as being a mighty hunter and a founder of the city of Babel or Babylon. And he founded a kingdom in the land of Shinar. Shinar is a region that we would also refer to as Mesopotamia, land between the rivers Euphrates and the Tigris, in what today would be Iraq. He's mentioned also in the prophet Micah, in Micah chapter 5 and verse 6, in connection with the nation of Assyria here. Micah chapter 5 verse 6, which says, they shall rule the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod with the drawn sword, and they shall deliver us from the Assyrian. So Assyria is referred to there in that verse as being the land of Nimrod, and that's the connection made here in Genesis chapter 10. We don't really know any more details about this Nimrod other than what we have here. Josephus does refer to some myths or legends about Nimrod. He was supposed to have been a bit of a tyrant, an oppressor of people. And when it says that he was a mighty hunter, not necessarily hunting animals, but hunting people. The Jewish Targum, which is a sort of translation and commentary, refers to him as being a murderer and one who is mighty in sin. But these are sort of myths or legends that have developed around this name Nimrod. None of that is actually found here in the text itself. We're just told of him being a prominent sort of character. Also, some of these myths identify him as the one who led the people in the building of the Tower of Babel, as we'll come to in chapter 11 shortly. But we see the region in which he is associated there, Babel, which is Babylon, the land of Shinar, Assyria is mentioned, and Nineveh, of course, we're familiar with the name of the city of Nineveh as well. A mention is also made here of the descendants of Canaan. They are, of course, play a significant part in the history of Israel. So from verse 15 of chapter 10, we have Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Archites, the Sinites, the Arvites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites, Afterward, the families of the Canaanites spread abroad, and the territory of the Canaanites extended from Sidon in the direction of Gerar as far as Gaza, and in the direction of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim as far as Lasher. These are the sons of Ham by their families, their languages, their lands, and their nations. So some names listed there which would be familiar to us as the record is given there of the Canaanites. And again, because of the significance of these people in the history of Israel, the boundaries of Canaan's territory recorded there in verse 19 are really the boundaries of the land that God promised to give to Israel. The Israelites, of course, would go in under the leadership of Joshua and take this territory. The nations descended from Ham are thought to have populated the areas of northeast Africa, so Egypt and Libya and Ethiopia, and also the Palestinian coastal area as well, up the Mediterranean in that direction as well. Next then we have the descendants of Shem, verse 21, verse 32, to the end of the chapter there. And verse 21 notes that Shem was the elder brother of Japheth and the father of all the children of Eber. To Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the elder brother of Japheth, children were born. And then the sons of Shem, and then the names, we go into the names being listed there. The name Eber may be connected to the name Hebrew. It may, the name we're familiar with Hebrew may be derived from that name Eber here as well. And it would be through this line, the line of Shem and Eber, that Abraham would eventually be born, and then the descendants of Abraham coming through this line. Verse 25 refers to the division of the earth in the days of one of these descendants named Peleg. Verse 25 says, to Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. There's a play on words going on here with the name Peleg. Name Peleg means division, and the verse refers to the earth being divided during his days. It's not explained to us what that division is all about. Some suggest that it's referring to the events following the Tower of Babel incident in chapter 11, when the people were separated and divided and went their separate ways with the confusion of the language there. Others think that it's referring to a physical division of the land, so the separation of land masses, as with the continents, when the continents drift. But we can't be certain of any of this. It just simply says there that during his days the earth was divided, without any further explanation of that. The nations descended from Shem then populated the regions of southwest Asia and Arabia. And verse 32 then provides us with a summary of this chapter, of all what's gone on here. Verse 32, chapter 10 says, these are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. So Genesis chapter 10 then records the origins of these various nations before the story of Genesis then concentrates upon Abraham and his descendants. The genealogy of each son of Noah ends here with the reference to their families, their languages, their lands, and their nations. So we have this repeated in for each of the three sons in verse 5. The end there. These are the sons of Japheth in their lands, each with his own language, by their families in their nations. And verse 20, these are the sons of Ham by their families, their languages, their lands, and their nations. And then verse 31, these are the sons of Shem by their families, their languages, their lands, and their nations. So this is the structure, the pattern in which this is being presented here. The chapter names a total of 70 nations, 14 from the descendants of Japheth, 30 from Ham, and 26 from Shem. Again, there may be some significance in the number 70 there because of the 7 being that number of perfection. But the list is really a reminder to us that all of the nations have one common origin, that all come from God. Paul in Acts chapter 17 verse 26, when he was speaking to the people in Athens, refers to this common origin of mankind. He speaks of the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, not being served by human hands. And then in verse 26, Paul says, and he made from one every nation of men to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their habitation. So the nations, the existence of these nations is God's plan, God's purpose. God has put these nations in place and set their boundaries for them. So all the people of all of the nations are important to God, and all have the same need for salvation. The same list as we have here is recorded in a briefer format in First Chronicles at the beginning of that book, First Chronicles chapter 1, verses 1 to 25. Now, on the map here, you see where these nations are identified, or the descendants are, if you can see that there, the descendants of Japheth in red. We see that they're occupying what is today Turkey and the Middle East. They're across into southern Europe of Greece and Italy, even to southern France there. The descendants of Ham being along the land of Canaan there, all of those listed in yellow that we see there, and then in North Africa there with Egypt and across to Libya, and then going further south through Egypt and into Ethiopia, and then across into Arabia, region of what today would be Yemen, and then the descendants of Shem occupying that region as well, and then the area of Mesopotamia today is Iraq or Iran, that sort of area as well there. So you can see the names that are listed there. Again, there's no, we can't be absolutely certain about these things, but this is generally thought to be the areas where these nations or these descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, where they came to occupy these different territories there. Of course, this is the world as it is known at that time. There's nothing here to do with any southern hemisphere with America or northern Europe, but it's all centered around the world as it is known to those people at that time. We'll move on to chapter 11 here, and we have the interesting incident in chapter 11 verses 1 to 9 with the Tower of Babel. So we'll read these verses here. Now the whole earth had one language and few words, and as men migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. The chronological order of events here may be that this event took place before those genealogies of chapter 10. So this may be something that happened before that. But the incident recorded in these verses explains to us how the human population came to be scattered throughout the earth, and it accounts for the development of the different languages that are spoken by mankind. Verse 1 shows that for some time after the flood there was one human language. The verse says, now the whole earth had one language and few words. And it would also seem that the descendants of Noah were moving around as one mass of people in one group, living a nomadic lifestyle. And they migrated from the east and they settled on a plain in the land of Shinar in Mesopotamia, as we're told there in verse 2. The New International Version has a slightly different translation here in that they moved eastward. So some versions have that they migrated from the east, so they came from the east, and at least the New International Version, I'm not aware of other versions which have this, but they moved eastward, so they went to the east. I think perhaps it can be translated either way there. But they settled in the land of Shinar. Shinar is identified with Babylonia back in chapter 10 and in verse 10, with reference to Nimrod here. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech and Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. So we're back there with this. And whilst they're there, they developed the art of brick making. And bricks could be used then as a building material if there were a shortage of stone in the area where they had settled. So if there are no big stones for them to be able to build with, and so they're able to develop the process of brick making. The bricks are made of clay or mud mixed together with straw, and they would be fired in a kiln or dried out in the sun. We're told bricks in Egypt during their captivity and using similar sort of methods in Exodus chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. Exodus chapter 1, verse 13 and 14 speaks of the hard labor that the Israelites were put to by the Egyptians. So they made the people of Israel serve with rigor and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. And then in chapter 5 of Exodus, verses 7 and 8, where the supply of straw is withdrawn and they have to go and look for straw themselves, the straw being used in the brick making process. You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks, as heretofore let them go and gather straw for themselves, but the number of bricks which they made heretofore you shall lay upon them, you shall by no means lessen it, for they are idle there. So the straw was withdrawn and they had to go and look for it themselves, and the straw is mixed in with the mud or the clay in order to bind the brick together. Here in at Babel in Genesis chapter 11, we're told that they had brick for stone and bitumen for water. So brick is being used as a replacement and as a building material, which will be not readily available there. So they're making the bricks instead, and they're using bitumen for mortar, to serve as mortar. Bitumen is a sort of tar substance. People use it today on roofing to waterproof their roofs and so forth, and sometimes on repairing roads. It's that black tar substance. So the bitumen is being used in the building when the bricks are being laid one on top of the other instead of mortar, which cement that people would use today. So this bitumen is used to stick the bricks together. And bitumen would have been common in that area of southern Mesopotamia, so a plentiful supply of that there. So with this newfound ability to make these bricks, the people decided then to settle there and to build themselves a city with a tower rising up to the heavens, and to make a name of themselves so that they would be remembered for their achievements. The remains of multi-storied tower-like structures called ziggurats have been found in that region of Babylonia, or Iraq or Iran, which, as we know it today. And so this was a structure that was used. These were sort of stepped pyramids, and used as places of worship. The thought was that God could be worshipped at the top of these pyramids. We have a picture here of the remains of one of these, which is in Iran today, but many others found in the region of Iraq as well. So that sort of structure was quite common at that time. That the one there in Iran is dated from around 1200 BC, so probably around the time of Moses, that sort of period. So the people thought then that having this city with this tower would unify them, and it would prevent them from being scattered over the earth. They want to stick together. They probably thought that there was greater strength in staying together. However, this was not God's plan, and God had determined then to defeat their efforts here. From chapter 9, verse 1, after the flood, we see that God had wanted the earth to be filled. God blessed Noah and his sons after the flood, said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." And in verse 7 of chapter 9 there as well, and God's instruction is, "And you be fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly on the earth and multiply in it." So God wanted the earth to be filled, and not for people to just stick together in one place. Verse 5 of chapter 11 speaks of God coming down to see the city and the tower which they had built. The language here is anthropomorphic language, so it's attributing human characteristics to God, as if God could just turn up and have a look at what they were doing. It may indicate, from God's perception as well, the insignificance of what they're doing, in that God has to actually come down and look at what they're doing, that they're thinking that they can build this great structure up into the heavens, but to God it's insignificant, that he just has to come down and have a look at it. And God is concerned that this would only be the start of what they will do. In verse 6, God says, "Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." So the pride of man comes into play here, and the pride will cause him to think that he is self-sufficient and that he can do anything. It's an attitude which reflects a lack of trust in God. The means by which God will put an end to this, though, will be by confusing their language, so they will not be able to understand one another. Exactly how God did this, though, we're not told. And of course, it would be very difficult to carry out your plans and intentions if you cannot understand or communicate with one another. Languages divide people rather than unify them, and we perhaps feel that today if we're amongst people who are speaking a different language to ourselves. We don't feel part of the group. So languages have that effect of dividing people rather than bringing them together. Those who speak a language that we cannot understand are regarded as being foreigners, and we're afraid of them, perhaps. So this is the effect that this has. So the confusion of the language then had the effect of scattering the people throughout the earth, which had been God's intention in the first place. So the people left off building their city then, and they went their separate ways. The name Babel is given to this place where the incident took place, because it was there that the Lord had confused the language, and it was from there that mankind was scattered over the earth. The name Babel is the Hebrew form is Bavel, and it's similar to the Hebrew word for confusion, which is Balal, So there's a play on words going on here as well, Babel and Balal, confusion, um, meaning to babble. We have the word babble, or speak of people babbling if we don't understand what they are saying, and that's where our word babble comes from. The name Babylon itself it seems to have been derived from the name Babel as well. Although the incident at Babel here had resulted in many languages being spoken and the human population being scattered, later on, when we come into Acts chapter 2, we see how God empowered the apostles to speak in many languages before Peter preached the gospel to the crowds who were gathered there in Jerusalem. So the many languages being spoken by the people in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost did not prevent the gospel from being preached to them. So in a way, Pentecost was Babel in reverse, that yes, those people in Jerusalem were speaking all their own languages, but they came together and they heard the gospel being preached. The last section for Genesis chapter 11, we go back to another list of names here. We have a record of the descendants of Shem here. Another of these introductory statements in verse 10, these are the descendants of Shem. And then we go into the list once again here. And the line of Shem's descendants is followed through to Terah, who is the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran, down there at the end in verse 26. The same pattern is being followed here as we saw in chapter 5, where we had that genealogy in chapter 5. So it's when person A was X years old, he became the father of person B, and A lived after the birth of B for Y number of years and had other sons and daughters. They notice that repeated pattern there as we follow the line through. The total number here, if you add them up there, it totals up to 365 years from Shem leaving the ark through to Abram. 365 years. It might not to think that these genealogies are complete, but that's if you were to add up the number of years, that's what that would come to there. But that's not necessarily the full length of time from Shem to Abram. We notice also here the shorter lifespans of these people compared to the period before the flood, which we had in chapter 5, where people were living to 900 years old and above 900 years old. Methuselah 969 years old. So in this list, Shem's lifespan is the longest at 600 years, whilst Nahor's in verse 24 is the shortest at 148 years. And apart from Shem, who we're told was 100 years old when he had his first son, the age at which most of these people had children was around 30 years old. So similar to what people would have today, really, starting a family at 30 years old, or a bit younger than that, perhaps. These names that are mentioned here are recorded in the genealogy of Jesus as well, in Luke's account, in Luke chapter 3, verses 34 to 36. So those names are listed there in the genealogy of Jesus. So the purpose of this then really is to bring us up to show us the background of Abraham and the where Abraham fits in with the story. And then at the end, the final few verses of chapter 11, which we'll look at next week, we focus in upon Abraham, and then his story really begins in chapter 12 there of Genesis. So to think about a few things here, a few things for us to reflect on, having gone through these two chapters this evening. We belong to the same world and we share common origins. That's a thought that comes out of all this. So what implications does that have for how we should treat one another? What can we do to better understand people of different nations and cultures? You mentioned languages. People speak still today, speaking different languages. People have different cultural practices and so forth. How can we try to understand people who are different to ourselves, who speak a different language or live in a different culture? And then what did the people hope to achieve by building that high tower there in Babel? And what was that all about? And then what parallels do you see between what the people were doing there at Babel and our own world today? So those are a few things that we can reflect upon or think about from these chapters. So we will stop there. And if anyone has any thoughts or comments,